of the pharmacokinetic pharmacodynamic section. Try today to cover what are the types of receptors interaction and what's the relation between drug concentration and response, and basic characteristic of agonist dose response curve, and how you can distinguish between competitive and non-competitive, and how to calculate the potency, and also what's the role of sparing receptors in regulating the potency of an agonist, and action of partial agonist and inverse agonist. So, in simple, pharmacodynamics is the interaction between a receptor and a drug. So the drug have to bind to the receptor to make its action. Then what happens next is defined under pharmacodynamics. So the receptor in history, the concept itself was developed in the early 1900s, so more than a decade ago. And it was developed by Ehrlich, who developed a structure-activity relationship for sulfonamides, and coined the term receptor because he called them receptive substance, which supposedly will bind to the drug you're giving and do something. Then followed by Langley, the pioneer of neuropharmacology, who noted that the blockade of muscles contraction by Curer, which is one of the poisons that they used to catch rays. At the same time, they discovered later it's a neuromuscular blocker, then developed multiple drugs from that same structure to be muscle relaxant. That's very commonly used before surgery to make it easy for the surgeon to cut in a muscle. The muscle has to be relaxed, so they use this after with anesthesia to help the surgeon start the work. Then after that, they discovered that acetylcholine as the first neurotransmitter, but the concept was not accepted for many years. It took many years until they accepted that, and they discovered the epinephrine and established many properties of neurotransmitters based on norepinephrine. So for this idea that there is a receptor and there is a concept of receptors, there are consequences for that. First, receptors largely determine the quantitative relationship between dose and concentration. So for a drug to do an action in a specific concentration manner, the more you increase the concentration, the more the effect of this drug. That means there is moiety that the drug will bind to and observe or cause this action. The receptor affinity for binding a drug determines the concentration of the drug required to form a significant number of other receptor compounds. So some drugs have high affinity to receptors, so you don't need much of this drug. And some drugs have low affinity. You actually need to increase the concentration to get an action by that drug. So it's the affinity of the receptor to the drug, or the drug to the receptor, that decides how much you need of this drug to get the action. Receptors are responsible for selectivity of drug action. There are drugs that only work on one receptor, and the majority of drugs work on multiple receptors. There is not one single drug that's 100% works on one receptor only. They have structure similarity with other receptors, so they may interact mostly with 5-hydroxytryptamine, but they have side effects on the cholinergic receptors, and so on. So the receptors are the moiety that's responsible for selectivity of a drug action, and obviously this is decided by molecular size of the drug, and also the size or the three-dimension configuration of the receptor. And also the charge of the drug. Some receptors have positive or negative moiety that binds to opposite charged drugs. So if you have a positive drug, very unlikely it's going to bind to a site in a receptor that's also positive. Receptors mediate the action of pharmacological agonist and antagonist. We know that you can use a drug to activate a receptor or inhibit a receptor. Both groups of drugs exist, and both groups of drugs are therapeutically valuable. So, in simple, you can classify drugs as agonist, or antagonist, or partial agonist, or inverse agonist. The drug will not be out of any of these four categories. So the agonist is a drug that binds and activates the receptor. And when you get to the next lectures of signaling pathway or signaling cascade, that means the drug will bind to the receptor and activate the signaling pathway linked to that receptor. And there are multiple types of receptors that have multiple types of signaling pathway attached to them. So the pharmacological antagonists at the same time are the drugs that bind to a receptor and compete with or prevent the binding of other molecules. So they go there and bind and block the receptor. Nothing else can bind. Let that be the natural agonist or the natural ligand of a receptor, or any exogenous agonist you have. So for example, atropine binds to the cholinergic receptor and inhibits the cholinergic receptors, which means it prevents the access of this receptor to any natural ligand. In this case, it is. You know what's the natural ligand of receptors that atropine block? Acetylcholine, obviously. It's in the slide. So acetylcholine is the parasympathetic system transmitter. So if you have acetylcholine, you have a parasympathetic system active, which is responsible for rest and digest, or the activity that you usually do during the rest. And you have your GI movement and stuff like that. So if you block this with atropine, you end up stopping secretions, stopping movement of the GI, and that's why it's very commonly used before surgery. So to slow down all this movement and prevent secretions that can come back and get ingested into the lungs and cause problems during surgery. So it's given before surgery, which means after surgery, you need to reverse this because atropine will be there for a while. So you give us parasympathomimetic drug. And sympathomimetic means it looks like a parasympathetic drug, and so on. So the actions by turning on a receptor or turning off a receptor is extremely useful in treatment for patients, but at the same time, it's useful for research. You want to give cannabinoid receptor agonist, and you want to see if it can work through CB1 receptor versus CB2 receptor. How you tell? By giving a specific antagonist for one of the two groups. So you block CB1 and see if your drug still have an action, or block CB2 and see if your drug still have an action. And if it still have an action, obviously it works through the other receptor. Or maybe block both receptors, CB1 and CB2, and try your agonist, and if it still have an action, obviously it doesn't work through the cannabinoid receptor. It maybe works through other receptors, and so on. So you need to know when you're designing an experiment, what are your tools? If you're going to test it in an Shenson system, you go for ACE inhibitors, for example, you need to know what's the affinity of this drug to the receptor, how much do I need to use based on the binding and the activity of this receptor, and so on. There are other group of drugs that bind to the same receptor and don't prevent binding with other agonists, and we're going to see this in the graph. It's going to be very obvious when you see this. And they act allosterically and enhance or inhibit other drugs. So maybe it makes it easier for you. So this is an example. The top one here, the drug is an agonist, binds to this active site of the receptor, and makes an action. So this is the graph. Okay? This is one, A alone. Okay? So this is the level with the dose of A, this is the response you get. Then you can have B, which is, in this case, a partial agonist. It's an antagonist. It competes with A. So both of them are fighting for the same place, which means at lower doses of A, you get nothing because this part is blocked by B. Then when you increase the concentration of A, further you go this way, it starts shifting or starts displacing B and giving you some action. So this is an agonist and an antagonist competing at the same site. Where you can have some other drugs binding to other sites. This is why we call it allosteric binding. They're not binding to the active site, but binding to another part of the enzyme or another part of the receptor and modifying the activity of the active site. So drugs bind to the active site and exert their action, but that doesn't mean this is the only site on the receptor. There are other sites that if you bind a drug to this site, for example, maybe changing the conformation of this site and becomes inactive. Similar, like if you see here in number D, A and D, when you add the D, you reduce the activity of the receptor regardless of the addition of A, you have reduced response. Where in the case of C, maybe if you add C to this other site, you're enhancing the activity. You're changing the structure of this active site in a specific way which makes it more active. Then you actually get more response. So these are called modulators of the action. They modulate the effect. They don't inhibit or they don't compete at the same receptor, but they can enhance the activity or reduce it by binding to other sites or allosteric sites. Other drugs may also work by protecting your natural transmitter or your original ligand for the receptor. For example, a group of drugs called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. So you know that when acetylcholine does its action, it has to be broken down to be cleared from circulation using an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which breaks down the acetylcholine to its original component. If you give an inhibitor to this enzyme, you're actually protecting your natural ligand. So you're not making new drugs. You're not creating new molecule. You're simply preserving your natural agonist for this receptor, which is acetylcholine. So you're enhancing the action of this receptor without getting any other factor from outside. You simply protected your natural ligand and stopped its breakdown. And because of that, they amplify the effect of the physiological agonist, and that's why their action is actually more safer than any other drug and less toxic, because there is no other agent on board. You're actually using your own ligand, but making it last longer by stop its breakdown. So, clear so far? So this is another concept that needs slightly some focus. Agonist and partial agonist and inverse agonist. There is that theory that the receptors are in two different conformations all the time. Active form of a receptor and inhibited form of the receptor, RA and RI. So this is the active form and this is the inhibited form. And that the receptor moves between these two conformations and exists in these two conformations all the time. Then when you give a drug, the drug will bind to one of these receptors. And this is where the affinity of the drug or the type of the drug decides. So it will bind to one of these receptors and stabilize one of these receptors. So if you give a drug that binds to the active receptor and pushes it to be more active, you get an effect from this drug, or you get effect through activation of this receptor. So this is the graph for drug, active drug plus active receptor. You get the full agonist of full response. On the other hand, partial agonists, they actually bind with equal affinity to both conformations. So you need more of the drug to give action, because if you give a grab, half of it will go bind to the RA and half of it will go bind to RI. So the net effect will be reduced. This is why it's a partial agonist. Inverse agonist actually binds to the RA active receptor and inhibits its action. That's why it's usually used, or in the terminology, that you're inhibiting the natural zone. So normally this receptor is active at a specific level, and when you give an inverse agonist, it binds but inhibits the receptor. And we're going to come back why we're calling it agonist if it's inhibiting the receptor at the end of the lecture. So, to recap again, receptors are postulated to exist into inactive and active form all the time. Even in the absence of any agonist, this part, that's the RA, or it's the active form, will have an effect, and it's called a constitutive activity. So it has its own activity. The difference between the drugs is that the agonist will have a much higher affinity for the RA, and it binds to it and gives the action, where the antagonist will inhibit that receptor, and the partial agonist will have equal affinity to the RA and RI, the active receptor and the inhibited receptor. Yeah, another thing here, the inverse agonists usually have higher affinity for the RI conformation. Okay, and I added some of the notes in the notes section of the slides. You can probably look at it to explain some of these heavy graphs. And this is coming out of chapter 2 in Katzen. So as I said in the beginning of the lecture, this is chapter 1 and 2 will have all the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics part. So what's the relation between drug concentration and response? You hope it's a simple relation. The more drug you get, the more action you get, but it's not. The relation between a drug and dose and clinical action is really complex because you have multiple factors involved. You have obviously the absorption, the distribution, and the elimination process. And even in the existence of that, all these factors are constant, you still have multiple receptors competing for the same drug, because the drug could be acting on multiple receptors. At the same time, you could have other drugs doing opposite action. So it's not a straight line where it's becoming easy. Give 1 gram, you get this response. Give 2 grams, you get double the response. It's not that simple. In a carefully controlled in vitro system, which is most of the time how the drugs are tested, you're not testing them in human at the beginning, the relation between concentration and drug is often simple in these systems because you're taking out of consideration all the elimination and the excretion process. This relation is actually could be seen in this graph. So if you're adding drugs, which is the concentration, you go to the right side, you're adding more drugs, so the concentration is building up, and comparing this to the effect. You notice it's not a flat straight line, it's curved line. So this kind of line, it takes probably this much of drug to get 50% of the effect. Then it starts to be less steep. Then after you reach the maximum effect, it actually starts to become more flat. It's not getting higher than that. This is the Emax, or the maximum effect. So when you're trying to get information about the drug, this is the kind of the graphs and this is the kind of terminology you're actually sharing even when deciding about doses. What's the EC, the effective concentration 50 for this drug? Or what's the Emax of this drug? So, and if you compare this to the binding of the receptor, you see that almost at the same level where there is effective concentration 50 is the KD, or the dissociation constant, which represents the concentration at which half of the receptors will be bound and half of the receptors will be free. Okay? And also Bmax is the maximum binding. So this relation is governed by this equation, where the effect at any time is the Emax is the maximum effect times the concentration at that point, divided by the concentration plus EC50. So that's why the curve is not straight, it's curved somehow. And as we said, Emax is the maximum response that can be produced by this drug regardless how much you increase the dose, and EC50 is the concentration of the drug that produces 50% of this Emax. Okay? For the binding, if you notice it's almost exactly the same. You replace the E with a P. Instead of effect, it becomes binding, equals Pmax times the concentration of the drug you're adding divided by the concentration plus the KD, or the dissociation constant, which is the equilibrium dissociation constant, concentration of free drug at which half maximal binding is observed, like half of the receptors are bound and half of it is still free. This KD of a value for any drug is very characteristic and characterizes receptor affinity for binding. And look at this sentence carefully. If the KD is low, the binding affinity is high, and vice versa. What does that mean? If I have to go, like, let's assume that this is 100 nanogram, and this is the KD of this drug, which means I will need 100 nanogram to fill half the receptors. So this is the kind of affinity. If I have another drug where the KD is at 50 nanogram, what does that mean? The KD value is less, which means I will only need 50 instead of 100 to fill half the receptor, which means at 50, the drug is having higher affinity to the receptors and able to saturate half the receptors without the need to go for a higher concentration. So the less the KD value, the higher the affinity. And the other way around. If it takes 200 nanograms to reach EC50, then the drug has less affinity to the receptor. Okay? Is that clear? The more affinity the drug has to the receptor, the less amount you need to reach 50% saturation, and so on. Okay, so this is an example of the effect of another concept which is called spared receptors. So for drug A, when you give a drug, they increase the concentration, they increase the effect of this drug, or the agonist effect of this drug. So this is the agonist response in the absence of any antagonist. And this is the EC50 for that, which is the concentration of A that gets you the 50% of the effect. In the second graph, which is B, after treatment with lower concentration of antagonist. And notice the word shift to the right and shift to the left. You have to be able to recognize these terms when you're talking about these kind of graphs. What does it mean, the shift to the right? In a simple term, what's the A and B compare? Regarding to the concentration of A, what does it mean? If the curve is shifted to the right, you need higher concentration to achieve the same effect. So the effect, the 50% of the effect was achieved at this point of concentration, where in case of B, you actually need more. So you shifted the graph to the right. You did not affect the affinity, it's just simply you're competing with this drug for the same receptor, so you need more, because it's competitive antagonist. Okay? But you still can achieve to the maximum response. You're not affecting the maximum response. Then you added more concentration, and this is now C. So you also need more concentration to achieve the same EC50. But at this stage, the spare receptors are already used, just enough for you to get the action. And if I want to think about it in a simple term, let's assume that I have so let's assume I have 10 receptors. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I need only 3 receptors to do the action. So these 3 receptors are 3 drugs, which is A, bound to the 3 receptors and does the action. Okay? Then I added B. So B started competing with these receptors. And now it's a competition, and B is blocking these receptors. And A still have access to the remaining receptors, simply have to compete with it, that's why I need higher concentration. Then added C, and now C is blocking the remaining receptors. So A will have to fight with A, B, and C to get to its action. But still, after binding to all the needed amount of receptors, will achieve the maximum effect it needs. So having the ability to bind to the same number of receptors will mean that you can achieve the maximum response. It may take you longer, that's why you need high concentration because of the competition. If I added more concentration, and now we are at D, then D starts binding to this receptor and saying, oh, I'm gonna get this one. So A will take longer to achieve its action because now he has to compete with B and C and D concentrations. But also will never achieve the maximum effect because we have only 2/3 the number of receptors. So the maximum effect will be actually used. And obviously it's going to be shifted to a later time because it will take time until he competes, then only reaches 2/3 of the effect. Okay? Because the number of available receptors is reduced. And this is the idea that all of them were spare receptors that the agonists did not have to use to do the action. They were there to help provide enough target for the drug. but at the same time, it's a site for competition with the antagonist. Until you completely saturate all of them, then you start cutting down from the receptors available for the agonist. Got it? If you look at this, you can see that at the level of concentration in graph B, there's still enough spread receptors. You can reach the maximum effect. At C, you still reach the maximum effect. At this level of adding the agonist at concentration D, you start having a reduction of your maximum effect because now you saturated all spread receptors. At E, it's even more. Then you actually get this one out to, then you reduce the reaction probably to 25%, and so on. Okay? So we're going to talk about another concept, competitive and irreversible antagonist. The antagonist can bind to the receptor and do one of two things. One thing is that when you add more of drug A, okay, it starts displacing this and saying, I'm going to take your space because it's competition, and you get more action. The other case is that this receptor or this antagonist is binding to this receptor and saying, no, I'm not moving. Even if you add hundreds, this is my place. I'm stuck here irreversibly. I'm not leaving. Then either do a structural change of the receptor where it's not recovered, you cannot recover, and at the same time, some of the drugs, for example, bind to the red blood cells. The only way to clear them out is simply to change your red blood cells after 3 months. So once they bound to this kind of red blood cells and have the same enzymes in that red blood cells, there's no way to get rid of it unless you change your red blood cells, which happens naturally every 3 months or 4 months, every 120 days, and so on. So some of these drugs, when it's blocking the receptor or the receptor irreversibly, the only way to get rid of them is by changing the receptor or replacing the receptor, which happens very frequently for multiple receptors, that they actually get recycled and chewed up by the cell and cleaned and restructured again, or cut into pieces and reformed again. So this is receptor recycling. So how we can differentiate between them from a graph, and I'm going to see the graph in a second. So competitive antagonism, which means in the presence of a fixed concentration of agonist, increasing concentration of this kind of antagonist progressively inhibit the agonist response, where high concentration of antagonist will prevent response completely. Let's see that. So you have this action, and the agonist alone in the blue line, then you come here to the green line, where you're adding enough concentrations of the antagonist. The more you add of the antagonist, you probably can completely compete with this agonist and block the action starts going down. Let's leave the non-competitive for now. Conversely, sufficient high concentration of the agonist can surmount the effect of the low concentration of the antagonist. What does that mean? If it's a competition, the more amount of the agonist you add, the more able you are to recover the response. This receptor will come, this new drug that you're adding, if it's only competitive, will start recovering back and binding to this receptor and recovering the response back. So this actually was the scientists were able to use this kind of a phenomena that is a competition and it's concentration based. The more I have from the agonist, I will be able to take the antagonist out and take its place and recover my action. So they created an equation where they actually measured how much does it take you to do the action in the absence of the antagonist versus how much does it take you to do the same action in the presence of a specific concentration of antagonist, okay? Which is the DR ratio. So, for example, if you look at this graph, it takes you this kind of concentration, C, to produce 50% of the action. Where in the presence of the antagonist, it takes you C dash to produce the same effect. Okay? That C dash is equivalent to C times 1 plus I over K. Okay? What does that mean? Ki is the dissociation constant, and I is the concentration of this inhibitor, which which is the inhibitor concentration, okay? So when you plot C dash divided by C, which is the concentration that you need to achieve the same effect in the presence of the I, concentration of the competitive antagonist or competitive inhibitor, divided by the concentration in the absence of any competition, equal 1 plus I divided by Ki. Okay? And actually, I deleted the idea that you plotted by shield equation because it's really complex. It's not point for it. So I removed that slide. It's not there. Okay. So let's look at one thing. If I have when will the I concentration will be equivalent to the inhibitory concentration or the Ki? At what condition would that be? Yeah, that's the second slide. You read that. I can tell that you read that. Okay, it's in the second slide. When C dash is twice C, then I will equal Ki. Why? If you think about this, 2 divided by 1 is 2, equals 1 plus, this has to be 1. So in this case, the I concentration of the inhibitor is equivalent to the Ki, which is the dissociation constant. Okay? So this could be a point for multiple choice question, or calculate Ki, at what concentration you'll achieve the Ki, and so on. On the other hand, the non-competitive antagonist, regardless how much you add, it's simply you're reducing the action because it's blocking a specific set of receptors and reducing the action. Do you think this kind of concept will work for this? If there is any way that you achieve the same effect at any dose you add from the drug, no way, you're not achieving that level anyway. So regardless how much you go on this side, which is the dose axis, you cannot achieve the same concentration. So that becomes, C becomes infinity, C dash becomes infinity. I have this here at some point. Yeah. Okay, we have this at the end, we can look at it at the end. Okay, another concept that's related to the receptor drug binding is the kind of graphs that you have for dose response curve. You have one of two graphs. Either it's a graded response, the more drug you add, in this case, the more response you get, which is increase in heart rate or heartbeats per minute. So this is probably a tachycardic drug or maybe norepinephrine that increases heart rate. So the more drug you give, the higher heart rate will go, and so on. So this is a graded dose response. That you can have every specific concentration, there is a response, and it's going gradually. It's for every unit increase of the drug, you get an increase in the response. Where the other kind is quantile response, which means it's all or none. And this is usually it's used for assessing the toxicity of most of the drugs. I can say at this concentration, this test animal will die or not. I increase the concentration, the animal is still alive. So my answer is no. I increase the concentration, now it's dead. So the response will be how many of the animals tested at this concentration is dead. So at 100 microgram per kilogram of atropine, 20% of the test animal was dead. At 1,000, 60% was dead. At 10,000, almost 90% of the animals is dead, and so on. So the response is yes or no. It's not gradual increase. That's why it's called quantile dose response curve. And these are usually used to assess the toxicity of the drug most of the time. Or even if the response is there's a twitch of the muscle or no twitch of the muscle. So it's not partial twitching. No, the muscle moved or did not move. So this kind of response you have to plot on a graph percentage success or percentage twitching and so on. Okay. And this is a concept that we talked about last time. It's just simply because we're talking about these two graphs. here you can have the effective concentration 50 from this graph. If you have, say for example, I need this target to be my effective concentration 50. I know it's around 40 or 50 microgram, where at 1,000, I'm killing half of the animals. That's right? So the therapeutic index for this drug would be how much? Let's go back again. I'm assuming that the two graphs are from the same drug. For example, it takes me around 50 microgram to get half the response I need, which is effective concentration 50. And it takes me around 1,000 grams to kill half of the animals of half of the subject. So I have two numbers, 1,000 and a 50. So what's the therapeutic index? No. You divide the two numbers.
1.
1,000 divided by 50. It's 20. 1,000 divided by 50. 20. It's the dose that kills half the animals divided by those that treats half the animals. If you look at the graph, it's lethal dose 50 divided by effective dose 50. Okay? And we said that some drugs have a very narrow therapeutic index or therapeutic margin, like such as the digoxin, which is 2. For 1 dose you can treat, for double the dose you kill the animal. For morphine it's 5, and this is scary when you're actually approving doses as a pharmacist, where the physician doubles the dose, triples the dose, and he doesn't know that the patient was actually taking half of this dose and was fine. Then he comes back, oh, 500 grams is nothing. Then he goes to 10. Then he goes to 15. And then, oh my God, he's already 5 times the concentration. There's highly chance that this person will die because he's sensitive to morphine more than anybody else, and he was actually controlled at 1/5 of this dose already. So these are drugs that you really, when you're working with as a physician, or checking as a pharmacist, or even working with an animal concentration, you have to be careful, because the higher the dose you go, the high chance there's a resistance.
How do you interpret those numbers? Is it times the dosage that you're already given? Like they can have 2 times, whatever. Like how do you?
It's the daily dose, the daily consumption dose.
That's what the TI stands for. The therapeutic index.
Therapeutic index is actually it's once you reach steady state concentration and you're actually treating this patient, then you get 50% of this dose. This is the effective dose 50. The dose that treats 50% of your population. And usually these numbers are done in rats or mice or whatever species of animals that susceptible to the action you're testing. So you give the animal the drug and say, I need to increase blood pressure 10 millimeter mercury. And okay, I say I give 55 milligram and I only raised it in 10% of the animals. I give 10 milligram, I raised it in half of these animals. So this is your effective concentration 50. Then you start raising the dose and say when they will start dying and what dose will kill half of these animals. You start maybe with 20 animals. Then you raise it to 100 milligrams, then you start losing half of your animals. So this becomes your lethal dose 50. It's used to make sure that whenever you're prescribing a dose to a human, you never reach close to this dose. You say, whatever, if it's not working, switch drugs. Because if you go past this point, highly likely you're going to kill them, because 50% of the animals died at this dose. So, in other words, the difference between treatment range and toxic range, the harder it is to treat. But at the same time, some of these drugs have no other substitutes. For aspirin, it's very safe. Like some people try to commit suicide with aspirin. They will need to take a 50-tablet vial before they actually reach a toxic level. So it's very unlikely, but some people do. You can get, if you're watching the emergency department sheet every day, you can have a suicidal attempt every day.
So you said most of these lethal doses are found in animals. So is there like a scale they use to scale it up to size for human beings?
Yeah. So you base the dose in animals per kilogram. And when you go to human being, you start there, but that's not enough, because obviously if you remember from the way first lecture, you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, where you test the same dose in healthy volunteers, then you go to sick patients and so on. So the doses that you find in animals is just a guide, and especially toxic doses, a guide for you to avoid. But that doesn't mean animals will be treated at the exactly same dose range per kilogram as humans, because obviously animals have different metabolism in some cases. Kidney function in some of the rat models may not exactly match humans. and obviously if it's a sick human, it's a completely disturbed system. So that's why you have phase 1 to establish an okay dose or a safe dose in human, then go for the target population or the patient, then you try it again at, you go gradually, you start with a lower dose, then you increase it until you say, okay, this dose is fine, it's treating them, and it's not killing them, and so on. So that phase of development is actually one of the most time-consuming and expensive. And some of the drugs I was reading yesterday, one of the drugs was pulled completely from the market after having 18 deaths within the first phase 1. So that's crazy because these are healthy volunteers, and you lost 18 people immediately. So I have no idea why anybody would volunteer for a healthy phase 1 trial, but they will, and that's all it counts at that point.
He's trying to pay for grad school.
Yeah, maybe trying to get himself through medical school. Yes, crazy people.
Sign me up.
Yeah, they're fighting to sign up for this because they're assuming it's safe. Unfortunately, it's not. Because you could have the best, safest profile in animal models. Then once you move to human, you discover that this drug target an enzyme that doesn't exist in rats. Then as a sudden, it's killing people. And rats are not tiny human. They're completely different. They have their own systems, and this is a problem for extrapolating data from rats to human. They don't match. Sometimes they don't match completely. So this is how it's used to be tested, or this is how we went through pharmacology classes in 1990. But actually, we had to isolate an ileum from a guinea pig. And do you guys know what's a guinea pig? Is it big or something like tiny rabbit? They're not that tiny, and some people have them as a pet. But you isolate the ileum, which sometimes has no intrinsic activity, so it's not going to move until you do electric stimulation. So you either stimulate the ileum to start moving this pendular movement, and you get this kind of graph on a smoked drum, which means a drum that has smoke on it, so it's completely black, and the needle that's movement attached with the ileum will start drawing this kind of lines up and down, contraction and relaxation. Then you start treating with drugs. So this is, for example, if this is your baseline, you add dihydromorphine, it starts inhibiting gradually, you're going up in the dose, minus 10 to the power of minus 8 molar, go up, minus 7, and so on. So the more drugs you add, the more inhibition of this motility of the receptor, of the ileum. So you know that this drug actually slowing down the GI motility if you give this drug to the patient, and it's gradual, dose dependent, and so on. Codeine is the same way, or itorfen. So this is how they use to assess how drugs work. Now you have simulated models where you actually can have structure like completely constructed receptor in an in vitro system, where you try to test the binding and competition at that in vitro system. This is just an iteration having all these 4 concepts together. 80-50 refers to effective dose of the drug. This is commonly used for the in vivo experiments. Effective concentration 50, usually common for the in vitro, because here it's effective, and this is therapeutic dose. Inhibitory concentration 50, also used commonly for receptor binding, and we're going to see this at the end of the lecture. Dissociation constant measures the affinity of drug for receptors and often determines drug potency. The higher the KD, what's the potency or the affinity? Lower. Good job, folks. Okay. So the agonist action depends on binding and effector. So it has to bind to the binding site and the receptor and do the action. The agonist binds and produces a response, where the antagonist binds but doesn't produce a response. In fact, it just binds and stops the receptor from binding to any agonist. And if the receptor was tonically or constitutively active, then it starts declining its action. Okay? And it could be competitive or not competitive. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 other concepts, which is affinity and potency, okay? So To choose among drugs and determine appropriate dose of drug, the prescriber must know these two things, the potency and the maximal efficacy of the drug. How potent is this drug and how much of an effect can I achieve? So you may have a drug that's very potent, but you're not achieving much. Or a drug that's less potent, but you can achieve a maximum response. And what does that difference mean? Okay? These two important terms are often confusing and can be explained by the following graph, as I say, which depicted graded response curves that relate to those 4 different drugs to the magnitude of their effect. Look at the graph and tell me what you think, what you get from this graph, and I have enough explanation on it. So, which one is the most potent? And it's already on the slide. A or B? Let's just say A. Let's just say B. B. Okay, it's B. The potency is decided how fast I can achieve this action and at which dose. If I'm looking at the effective concentration 50% of this effect is here. That's right? This part. For B. For A, 50% is here. So it's higher dose. So when you need higher dose, it's you're less potent to achieve 50%. So, but both drugs, A and B, are more potent than C and D. That's right? That's safe to assume. Okay. So potency refers to the concentration or effective concentration 50 or effective dose 50 of a drug to get 50% of the maximum effect. And that maximum effect may vary, okay? Then, if I'm comparing just A and B, B is more potent, but A have higher maximal effect. So if I need a drug to constrict the blood vessels very strongly, but I don't care how fast, should I choose A or B? A. But if I need a drug to constrict blood vessels now, regardless, and I can keep pumping the drug with an infusion. I have a patient coming to the emergency room, lost blood because of injury or something, and now his pressure is dropping, and there is no way to maintain his life unless you raise his pressure very fast. So you need something to work immediately, even if it's gonna break down and gets chewed up very fast and never achieve maximum effect. I only need to pump him up to keep him alive.
At the same time, why can't you just use higher concentration?
From D?
Well, yeah, I'm saying, like, isn't the x-axis isn't it comparing the concentration?
Yes.
Drug needed?
Yeah, but at the same time, the drug ability to go and bind to the receptor takes time. So this is why it takes time to, when you inject it, say in the body, it will take time to redistribute and reach to all the receptors and achieve enough concentration. For a drug that requires low concentration to be at the receptor, then you can use a drug that have higher potency, and maybe sometimes you supplement with another drug that have higher effect, go like back to back, where one of them will go and act fast, and the other will go and act and give you a stronger response later. And I understand your point, you can pump it high concentration, but sometimes you're limited with toxic range. You cannot just keep pumping drug at high concentration to achieve effect because there is a maximum limit. It's not going to go beyond this limit. So speeding up is not going to be always the solution. Because sometimes you could have your target as blood vessels, but the drug is toxic to the liver, or the drug is toxic to the eye. And if you speed infusion, sometimes if you increase the rate of lactated ringer than 75 milliliters per hour, it's ringer, it's nothing. But in presence of calcium or other drugs that have calcium, you can actually start having acute kidney failure and so on.
So, like, if a drug has a lower concentration compared to another drug, does that always mean, or for the most part, mean that it works quicker?
It's more potent. Yeah, if it needs less amount of drug to do the same action. means it works quicker. And even it's more potent. Even if you look for the same group of ACE inhibitors or statins, okay, if you look at statins, for example, you have simvastatin, atorvastatin, rovastatin, all this kind of group. They're not the same potency. Why? Because the effective dose that you need to inhibit the clostridium senses is different. Some of them require 80 milligrams, and some of them require only 40 milligrams, and some require only 5 milligrams. So even you cannot translate between these drugs as the same. When you look at these numbers, the one that you require 5 milligrams is more potent. It requires less amount to do the job that you need. Okay? It doesn't mean necessarily fast. It's just simply requires less amount.
So what a good example would be like something like Adderall, and a good example of A be like something like Vyvanse.
What's the second B?
I was saying like as comparing two different drugs that have like the similar response. So like for example, B be something like Adderall, and then A could be something like a Vyvanse or something like that. Is
It
that
could be. I really am not aware of the two exact numbers to judge. This is why you have tables for these numbers: the effective concentration 50, the KD, or the maximum effect. I can remember these two numbers to say yes or no, but it could be. You know. Okay. For C and D, C and D obviously less effective or less potent than D and A, but also the maximum effect can be achieved from both of them. So if I'm comparing maximum effect, A and C and D are the same, but for potency, A is greater than C, greater than D.
Is like the drug that has greater potency, like healthier
Healthier?
to take? Because you're not bombarding your
Less
system.
side effects. Chances of side effects goes down when you reduce the concentration because you're exposing the body to less drug. Like me, after being a pharmacist for almost 23 years, I hate taking medicine unless you really have to. Because anytime you introduce any drug, even if it's aspirin or Claritin for flu season or something like that, or allergy season, you're introducing a factor that can have the potential to destroy part of your organs. Kidney and liver gets bombarded all the time with toxic food. So now you're adding another factor, which is toxic medications. Unless you really need that medicine, don't take it. Okay? So if it's a vitamin, it's a supplement, it's all this kind of nonsense that people try to take just to be healthier, you're better off just sleeping extra 2 hours, which sometimes I don't have. I'm averaging now I'm almost down to 4 hours every single night. So yeah, that's not good, but some days it's worse than others. Like I have to be in the pharmacy until midnight. Go ahead.
So the potency, is that because there's less barriers for the drug to get to the receptors, or there's more
Or it's more
receptors?
efficiency of the drug. Once this receptor actually turns on the receptor faster things. Okay, so again, drug potency, effective concentration 50, drug efficacy is the maximum response you can achieve. Okay, so this is a competitive antagonist graph, and we're gonna have to calculate potency of this competitive antagonist at some point. I guess we're doing good on time. We have 10 slides to go. So this is the first graph shows the control drug alone, then the drug in presence of one X of the antagonist, and the graph is shifted to the right, okay, because it's maintained the same maximum effect, but it's taking longer or will take higher concentration, so it's shifted to the right. Then if you add 10x, it's also further shifted to the right. 100x, it's further more to the right. So the potency of the antagonist in this case is proportional to the shift on the effective concentration 50, and it's calculated by this equation. Okay, and this equation needs to be known. So if I need to calculate the efficacy or the potency of the antagonist, Ke, it's equal to the antagonist concentration I'm using, and divided by dr minus 1. And what's dr? dr is the effective concentration with the antagonist divided by the effective concentration without the antagonist. So if I'm looking at here, like let's for example this one, and this is the 50%. Concentration here is around say 2 micrograms. Then for the other one, it goes also to be around 6. Okay, so it means in the presence of 1x, I needed 3 times more of the drug. So the effective concentration 50 went from say 2 micrograms to 6. So the ratio is 6 divided by 2 is 3. So in this case, the GR in this equation is 3 minus 1. Then you submit the concentration of this antagonist, then you calculate the potency. When you add the concentration of antagonist, that's simply doubling the needed concentration. In this case, dr equals 2, which is in the presence of the antagonist, you need double the amount of the drug to do the action as in the absence of the antagonist. So in this case, key E equals 8, because if you submit here 2 minus 1 is 1, and these two was equal each other. The effective concentration constant, or the potency of the antagonist, equals the concentration of the antagonist. Okay, this is an example. Let's see. If you need effect in the presence of 100 nanomolar of antagonist, produces 20-fold increase in the agonist effective concentration. It's actually 21. I changed the numbers to make easier calculation. So if it's 21-fold increase, and you need 100 nanomolar to do that. So the Ke equals 100 divided by 21 minus 1 equals 5 nanomolar. Just change this to 21. I changed it for the 5 to be easier instead of the 4.88. Okay. So simply you substitute the amount of concentration of antagonist you're doing and how much of a change in the effective concentration you had minus 1. Clear? This is a different graph of the antagonist. And if you're not seeing the top of the slide, can you tell which kind of antagonism is this? There's no shift to the right. It's simply your maximum effect is going down. The more concentration of the drug you add, or the antagonist you add. So this is a non-competitive antagonist. This slight shift here, can anybody think why will it be? Between the control and this shift here, 1x of the antagonist. Spray receptors. The competitive antagonist at the beginning, when you add small amount, it's actually binding to the spray receptors and shifting the activity a little bit. Until you add enough, then you start losing the action. So spray receptors also may contribute to some of the shift in the graphs and the competitive antagonist, but very characteristic when you have a competitive, non-competitive irreversible antagonist, you have to have a reduction in the maximum efficacy because some of the receptors are completely taken out of the equation. They're not participating in the action of the drug anymore because this is irreversible binding, non-competitive. Okay? Usually, you have a reduction in the maximum response, but not usually the potency. Okay, if I'm doing the same equation, if I'm applying the A concentration and dr minus 1. So if I'm looking at this graph, I need to get the concentration that gives me 50%, which is this one. Will I ever reach that in the presence of the antagonist? No. So I will take extremely infinitely high number to reach the 50% of the concentration of the drug alone. Then in this case, the dr becomes extremely high number. There's no change in the agonist potency, so dr equals 1 minus 1 minus 1 is 0. Then you have Ke is A divided by 0, and anything divided by 0 is an infinite number. So you cannot use this equation to calculate the potency of non-competitive antagonist. Non-competitive antagonist ability to block receptors is measured by the IC50. Okay? So this equation is only for competitive antagonists because you have to compare the concentration you need in the presence and in the absence of the antagonist, where you still maintain the the same potency. Okay, this is just a graph showing you how you calculate the IC50 for competitive antagonism. So you simply add your receptors, add your agonist, and in this case, most of the time it's radio-labeled or radioactive agonist that binds to the receptor. Then you compete with this by adding the antagonist. You're displacing the agonist from its binding site, and you calculate the radioactivity. This is just an example of something. If you work in a lab where they do radioligand binding assays, this is how it works. But you don't really have to go into details. It's the concentration that inhibits the binding of the drug to the receptors by 50%. So it's inhibitory concentration of 50. Okay. If I'm looking at these graphs, can I rank them? Which one is stronger inhibitor or more potent antagonist? Yeah, I can. This one requires the least to inhibit the binding 50%, just more potent. B and C and D will require high concentration from the antagonist to inhibit the binding of the agonist to the receptor by 50%. So the further left you are, the more potent you are as an antagonist. It takes you this much of a concentration to inhibit 50%, where this drug will take him that much. Okay. Spare receptors, and we talked about them in the previous graph. Now just more focus on them.
For the potency, why would it take less to inhibit the binding of one that was more potent?
It's less of the antagonist.
Oh, okay.
This is the potency of the antagonist. Okay, this is the last 7 slides, which are barely enough time. So spare receptors, we talked about them, or sometimes we call them receptor reserve, are said to be spared for a given pharmacological response if it's possible to elicit the maximal biologic response without using all of them. As if you remember, we said this drug A may bind only to part of the receptors and give 100% of its action. It doesn't need to bind to all the receptors. The remaining amount of receptors is simply spare receptors. So if it's possible to elicit a maximal biological response at a concentration of agonist, that doesn't result in if we bind all receptors. So the remaining part of receptors are spare receptors. Experimentally, spare receptors may be demonstrated by using a reversible antagonist to prevent binding of agonist to a portion of available receptors. So if there is no spare receptors, there's a 1-to-1 ratio between occupying the receptor and the response. But if there is spare receptors, for response to a drug occurs at less than for occupancy. What does that mean? If this receptor has nothing spare, if I combine all these 10 receptors to reduce the action, so if I only combine 9 of these receptors, I get 90% of the action, correct? If I combine only half of them, I get half the action, because I need to stimulate all 10 receptors to get maximal effect if there is no spare receptors. If there is spare receptors, I could combine part of it, then the remaining part is not contributing to the action. In this case, full response to a drug occurs at less than full occupancy of the receptors. Okay. Any other questions? A graph that can demonstrate that blockade of histamine-induced contraction of ileum by different doses of irreversible antagonists. So these are binding to the receptors and irreversibly blocking them. And this is what I was talking about a few minutes earlier. This is the effect in absence of any antagonist, which is just the control. Then when you add the 0.6 nanogram, the action is not reduced, it's simply shifted, because there is a spare receptors. Then you added 10 nanogram of the antagonist, you started seeing a slight shift and slight reduction. And when you added 100 nanogram of the antagonist, you completely reduced the action. So at the beginning, you were working in this area, just make it harder for the agonist to do the action. Then once you increase the concentration, you actually block all the receptors. And because it's irreversible, it's not competition-based, it's not concentration-based, your maximum response starts going down. Okay? So So think about it, if I'm talking about drug efficacy, full agonist will have an efficacy of 1, and full antagonist will have an efficacy of 0, it binds and do nothing, and partial agonist will have an efficacy that ranges between 0 and 1. And we're going to talk about the partial agonist now. And I know this graph may be slightly busy. But I think this one here will make it clearer when we get there. So, this dotted line is the this line is the full drug anon, yeah, drug A. It activates the receptors and does the action. In the presence of B, which is the antagonist or the partial agonist, it simply does action. So the partial agonist binds to the receptor but doesn't produce full effect, produce partial effect. Because if you remember, I said it binds to both the active receptor and the inactive receptor. So there's a limit how much you can achieve with this drug. If you have a mix of the two drugs, A and B, so in presence of higher concentration of the partial agonist, the effect of drug A, which is full agonist, will be reduced. Because now they're competing on the same receptor, and one of them was producing 100%, and the other is producing maybe 40%. But now they have to share receptors, and their action goes down. Maybe I can skip to this one and show it easier. Okay, so look at this graph. And this is percentage of maximal binding. So this is the binding of the full agonist alone. The more you add of the partial agonist, the more it's displacing the full agonist because they're competing for the same receptor. So this is the binding. By the end of higher concentration of partial agonist, it's mostly bound where the full agonist is not. If you look at the response, partial agonist alone will do this, low maximal effect, where full agonist will do this. If you have them both together, the more you add of the partial agonist, concentration-wise, the effect is going down until they reach to the point where the effect you're seeing is a mix of the partial agonist and the remaining amount of the full agonist that's bound. So this is the total response. Okay? This response is probably mediated by both the full agonist and the partial agonist. Okay, and this is why partial agonist must occupy a higher fraction of receptor than full agonist because it's weaker. Therefore, receptor reserve is smaller for partial agonist because instead of him having to bind 3 units, he has to bind 6 units, and then only the square receptors is less. Okay? I'm just gonna skip this slide. Just say it going. Okay, these are the last two things. The inverse agonist. Inverse agonist, on the other hand, it's an agonist, but it's inverse. So instead of producing an action, it's actually reducing the action. So they produce effect opposite to those done by full agonists. And you see this kind of group of drugs, if you spoke the first week about the cannabinoid receptors, there are multiple cannabinoid inverse agonists and partial agonists. So they produce effect opposite to what you expect if this was a full agonist. So they must be distinguished from functional effect that traditional agonist. The effect depends on the level of endogenous tone. So normally, you're not dead. Your receptors are actually being activated all the time. It's not waiting for you to get drug from outside to work. So there's a natural tone. And some pathological conditions or some diseases, most of the time it's simply you lose your natural tone. That's all that happens, nothing else. Normally you have your parasympathetic tone going to the heart, slowing down the heart. If this gets disturbed, you start having increased heart rate or tachycardia. So you simply lost your natural tone. So what does inverse agonists do is they bind to the receptor and prevent them from doing their tonic activity. So they could bind to ion channels and reverse action of full agonist, but also they could bind to G-protein-coupled receptors, which is going to be discussed next week, and inhibit their constitutive activity. If you look at this, this is how the agonist should look, which is the more concentration increase, the more effect. And this is the agonist in presence of antagonist, where it takes longer or takes higher concentration, so why this is a right shift. On the other hand, agonist, the inverse agonist by itself is reducing the effect. If you add an antagonist with an inverse agonist, they actually will compete with the receptor. The antagonist binds to the receptor and does nothing, where the inverse agonist will reduce the action, so they will compete. So you could also have a competition between an antagonist and an inverse agonist. Okay? So this is it. I probably will have homework hopefully by Friday, so you guys will have a week for that. Next Friday is the exam. Okay? And obviously you have a revision session this week or this Friday if you have questions. Steve will offer that too. Thank you. And obviously we have the literature review. Did you receive your papers for the research group and for the other group of papers? You probably got some emails today from Dr. Howard. Please read them and see if you get the idea. When you have a homework, send it back to the guy or the professor who assigned that homework. Not everyone, because there is no point getting tons of emails. We really don't know what to do with them. But at least make sure if it's Dr. Smith's homework, send it back to her. Dr. Jack, send it back to me. Okay? Dr. Howard sent her homework back to her, and so on. I don't want to assign you homework, just send it back to me, not everybody else. Do you have any questions?